Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the History of Comics. Today, I decided to do a two-part cycle on some properties from the 1980s and 90s that were published in the world of independent comics, who actually achieved some notoriety among the public because they were adapted into other media at the time. And one of them was part of a group of comic book characters that were adapted to the big screen with somewhat successful feature films. There was a list there. It's part of a list that included The Crow, The Mask, Barbed Wire, um, also Time Cop, Men in Black, and of course the most famous of all was the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Uh, this one was adapted by Disney, which is actually kind of appropriate, as it was not the, it was not something that was much in line with what was popular in comic books at the time. So we're of course talking about Rocketeer, which I have. This is the Brazilian graphic novel edition, which includes the first Rocketeer stories that were published by Pacific Comics. And here it is, the Artisan edition, which I bought some time ago and I've already read it, which reprints both of the both of the two Rocketeer adventures, as well as some art from by Dave Stevens. Dave Stevens, a very expressive artist. Unfortunately, not able to work at a pace that would have allowed him to become a big star at Marvel or DC, but he definitely he definitely had the talent. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us, suffered an untimely death a few years ago, and he is survived by his body of work, which is basically centered around this one character. Now, I wanted to show off the Rocketeer Artisan edition because it was shot from the original pencils, or better, from the original black and white art as it went to press before it was colored, and you can see here your part some unerased blue lines. I'm not sure if it's going to appear on camera. Probably, yeah, it's not showing up on camera, but you can see some unerased blue lines here on the speech balloons. Occasionally, you'll be able to find some paste ups. Let's see if I can find any. Not in here. No. Okay, but occasionally you could find some whiteouts and paste ups that were left here by Stevens. And IDW actually did a good job on doing this edition, because they managed to locate all but two of the original pages of art that Dave Stevens has produced for the Rocketeer. Those pages are indicated here as the non-original. For example, this one, it was shot. It's pixelized from a regular comic book. This is not one of the original pages of art. One thing about the Rocketeer was that this came out in the early 80s, and it's a classic piece of nostalgia at a time that most authors were, especially those that worked in mainstream superhero comics or in the adventure genres, like not only straight up action adventure, but also things like barbarian comics or horror. They were very much part of the wave of deconstruction that became prevalent during the 1980s, which gave us things like Watchmen and the Dark Knight Returns, and that is far from what we have here with Stevens. The colors are actually pretty good. They in the original edition, since the character's costume is brown, it makes use of a mostly yellowish palette, like you can see here. Also very expressive in some areas. The movement of the car here, typical of what you'd expect from old models with a wheel flying up in the air. And there are a few other things. Almost a slapstick type of art, the way the body language. It harkens back to the golden age of comics when there was less emphasis on detail. So you use this type of tricks to indicate emotion and action. But what Stevens does here is he's bringing back those tricks and basically using what you would consider uh, regular action type shots. Another interesting thing from this first adventure is that there are guest stars, which you would expect to find in comics because they had appeared in comics by then. But of course, Dave Stevens did not have the rights to add them. So when these two show up, if you're not if you're a fan of Doc Savage, you'll be very familiar with them. At the time that I read this for the first time, I was not. It was only when I bought the artisan edition that I was able to recognize the characters, especially as one of them identifies himself as Colonel May something, and that it's cut off. Of course, he's later identified as Colonel Mayberry, but who we actually have here. These characters are Monk Mayfair and Johnny Littlejohn, who are part of Doc Savage's team of assistants. And ultimately, Doc Savage as a cameo here. If you're familiar with Doc Savage, you'll be able to recognize the long johns under the wristbands. But of course, since he can't use the character, his face is obscured by this helmet. Quite clever, but and anyone who's familiar will be able to recognize. Another thing is that Cliff Secord, the man behind the mask of the Rocketeer, a stunt pilot, an opportunist, is not looking out to be a superhero of any sort, and he basically has to use his newfound equipment to right any wrongs. He ends up fighting a few Nazi spies. He ends is mostly by happenstance. He has no plans to become a crime fighter, so he mostly does it because somebody has to do it. So he has a girlfriend. That's the sort of the hot girlfriend, and of course, I can see from here. From here, yep. Okay, better. Or maybe here. Let's see now. Switching forth between black and white and color is actually good to make a comparison. Okay, here she is. Samuel Trejo is in the chat. Hi, Samuel. How are you doing? Have you read Rocketeer? Okay, so I was showing here that Cliff Secord had a girlfriend called Betty, and at the time, during the 1930s, the biggest queen of the pinups was Betty Page, and it's usually accepted that this is the real life Betty Page, being Cliff's girlfriend in this story, but she's always called Betty throughout. She's never referred to by Betty Page, which is actually good because I think she was still alive in the 1990s when they in the 1980s when they told this story, and she could have sued. So so at the time that they published this Brazilian edition, they still hadn't finished the second story in the United States. That would only happen. There was a 10-year interval between parts 2 and 3 of what was later called Cliff's New York Adventure. This is Cliff Secord going back from California to New York, and he's finally going after Betty, who basically left him in California to go to work with her photographer Marco. There are a few cameos around here. You know that is, of course, Clark Gable. And what we end up here is, since we had the Doc Savage in the first story, another familiar character will appear here. And here he's using his powers to creep into man's minds, as later appeared in his radio show. We are, of course, talking about the Shadow. But the Shadow is not called the Shadow here. He insists on being called Jonas. And he's hiring Cliff Secord to. He's actually helping Cliff because he's part of a group that is being targeted for murder. This was, I've been told, a very famous actor in the 1930s in horror movies, and he's being used here. Another thing, Stevens used more splash pages in the second story than in the first, which is of course natural. These were done in the late 80s and then in the mid 90s. So a few other things were needed in order to keep up with the market. And unfortunately, this was it. There are only these two Rocketeer adventures, which are. It ends here with Betty going back to Cliff. The Shadows in the same universe. Yeah, this is no, Samuel. This is not exactly a universe. What happened was that Dave Stevens was using easily identifiable parodies of Doc Savage in the first story and of the Shadow in the second story. They're not named as such because he didn't have the rights to use them. But the idea is that they're supposed to be them. There's a group of we call them fictionists. They're the Wold Newton Universe Society, and they base themselves on Philip Jose Farmer's theory that all of the main adventure characters from late 19th century literature and early 20th century pulp style novels are all related to each other and all part of the same universe. So they've incorporated these stories into the Wold Newton's unofficial timeline. They treat it as a game. There are several members there. What they do, even if they contradict each other, it's okay. They're building their own fictional universes, but it's not serious. It's interesting to read about it, but it's not serious. what we ended up so what we ended up here is a nice collection of art in two stories, harkening back to the golden age of comics, to the golden age of cinema, and to the forgotten pulp novels, which were no longer relevant after World War II. There's just one thing that is missing from this artisan edition. This one is a paperback. There's a larger hardcover volume, which I didn't buy because it was a bit out of my price range. But this has everything in it. But it's missing one thing, which is actually here in the Brazilian edition, which is an intro written by Arlen Ellison, where Harlan Ellison talks about being a bit honored to being called to write this, because it talks about an era that was part of his youth. So this is a short one. I wanted to show this off. Of course, the Rocketeer had a Disney movie in 1991. I only watched it once. Ted Comics is in the house. How you doing, Ted? Yeah, I'm about to close down. This is a special about the Rocketeer. This is the Brazil, as I said, this is the Brazilian edition. Collects the first story, and this is the artisan edition which was reproduced from the black and white pre-production art. The Rocketeer is one of the famous one of a few independent comic book characters from the 1980s who became famous, having been adapted to the big screen. Yeah, I think the Rocketeer movie is not very well known by new fans anymore. I don't see it on TV. I only watched it once. I don't remember it being shown on TV ever again. That was well over 20 years ago. The movie was fun. I think there's no mention of it. It doesn't exactly talk about being in the coming from comics. If you were not familiar with the comic book, you would not know that that was made into adapted from the comic, and they took out some of the parody elements. For example, Betty is still there, but Doc Savage was not. There was a show, I don't remember being a TV show of the Rocketeer. I think this would work great as an animated series. They'd have to tone down the parody aspects, or maybe they could do this for strictly for cable. That would be interesting. But I don't think that the Rocketeer is going to be appearing anymore in other media adaptations. When IDW reprinted the original series, they also launched a series of mini-series and an anthology called Rocketeer Adventures, I think. But I didn't buy those. They were done. They were done by contemporary writers and artists. Dave Stevens having already passed away. Yeah, they did good in that time. Dave Stevens, even if the Rocketeer did not sell very well, Dave Stevens is the type of artist that professionals like. So he's very well respected, and Rocketeer is cherished by the comics industry as one of the best works of the 1980s, especially because it stands out against all the gloom and doom of the deconstructionist comics, compared to stuff like the Punisher or Martial Law or the Watchmen. This is a lot more fun. So this is the Rocketeer, is the first of a two-part series. On the second part, I need to fish that book out. I'm going to be covering Xenozoic Tales. I have large volume that was published by Flash Publications, which includes nearly all of the original Xenozoic Tales comics. So that'll probably come soon. So Samuel Trejo and Tat Comics, thank you very much for taking the time to watch the video. I'll be coming back soon as soon as I finish rereading Xenozoic Tales, so you can have a follow up to this one. And and that's it for tonight. Goodbye, and thank you very much for watching. And until I come back, keep reading old comics. Okay.